Thank you. I just want to say I spent 7 years in the Middle East. So I come out of that region. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I speak Arabic, or I used to speak Arabic. It's kind of disappearing. So it's a region I know well, and months of my life were spent in Gaza. So the suffering of the Palestinians and the war crimes carried out by the Israelis are not abstractions to me. I reported on them day after day, week after week, month after month. I matched the lies that came out of Jerusalem. They would carry out airstrikes by F-16s on refugee camps and call it surgical strikes against bomb-making factories. And I was there looking at the bodies of the children in an entire obliterated street. I wrote a story for Harper's Magazine where I lived for 10 days in Khan Yunis and watched Palestinian border patrol taunt in Arabic. Ta'al means come, and then issue all sorts of slang curse words. And these kids are talking about 10, 11-year-old kids starting to throw rocks, and then they would shoot them. That wasn't conjecture. I got their names, I got the dates, I visited them in the hospital, and in a few cases went to their funerals. So I'm intimately familiar with the horror of the occupation and the brutal methods that are used by the apartheid state. They call it mowing the lawn, the indiscriminate killing. We talk about, 180 kids in Ukraine who have died, which is, of course, a horrible crime. But Susan, I think it was 2014 where we had, 521 Palestinian children who were murdered. Those who defend the apartheid state of Israel, let's never forget, as Alice knows, that the closest ally of the South African apartheid state was Israel up until the very end. The South African apartheid government gave Israel yellow cake, and in return, Israel helped them build a nuclear weapon. Their security and military and intelligence service were completely fused. There's a famous comment by the South African government that the reason they're so close to Israel is because they're both surrounded by brown people. And that apartheid system, which Israel, I think, very successfully in the early years managed through a compliant media and the kind of sympathy which should be delivered towards people who were victims or descended from the Holocaust, has been exposed. The brutality of the Israeli state is no longer in contention around the world. It's become a pariah state. So what is their tactic? Their tactic is to destroy those towering literary, moral, intellectual figures. Alice Walker would be close to the top of my list, who have the courage and have long had the courage to speak out on behalf of the Palestinians. They can't in any way confront the crimes. So what they do is they engage in these kinds of vicious smear campaigns. And Susan, we should mention Norman Finkelstein is another one, who's the son of he's been also completely hounded out of academia because he has the courage to challenge the Zionist narrative. I actually was made aware of what happened in the Bay Area Festival by Robert Scheer, who's the editor of Scheer Post, a wonderful journalist, another legendary journalist, a former editor of Ramparts. He's the one who called me. This is how it all started. And so I went back and investigated what happened. And what happened was there was a journalist named Yar Rosenberg who wrote a hit piece on Alice a few years ago. And that was, I went back and tracked it, was picked up by Vox and all sorts of other media uncritically. And he used Ike as a way to tar her as an anti-Semite. Because, of course, there's nothing in her life or her writing or anything she's ever said that would characterize, she's one of the fiercest fighters, anti-racist fighters we have. And again, it followed that complete trajectory of the figures that Susan mentioned. It doesn't matter whether it's Günter Grass, they tried to get his Nobel Prize rescinded. Anyone who has the courage, especially if they have that moral and intellectual stature, then they become hit. And so what I called the festival, I contacted the festival as to why they were doing this. They were doing this little dance that Alice wasn't being deplatformed because she was an anti-Semite. But then if you read their statement, they attack her for a poem that she wrote. I sent Alice an email. I was an English major, and as I guess Alice was. And I said, oh my God, people, what's happened to the ability to actually read poetry? She's attacking, as she should, all of those hateful passages that are embedded in religious texts. And she talks about Islamic, Christian, and Jewish, and they're all there. I'm a graduate of Harvard Divinity School, and although I hide it, I'm actually ordained Presbyterian minister. And and one of the first things those of us who care about justice and anti-racism have to do is disown those passages, and they are there. In my column, you can read it. It's on SharePost and it's on chrishedges.substack.com. But there's a litany of righteous genocidal acts blessed by Yahweh, and Paul, not only endorses slavery, he says slaves should look at their masters as if they're Christ. And all of that stuff has to be repudiated, and that's what she was raising. But of course, they selectively pulled that passage and distorted it and used it viciously. And so I went back and read the Ike. Now, the inner Calvinist in me doesn't connect with Ike too much. We were taught to footnote our sermons. So, but you know what? This is what appalled me, that people were relying on Rosenberg's smear interpretation. He writes for, I think it's called the Jewish Chronicle, some online Jewish magazine I never heard of. But you have to, and that's what I asked the festival. Did you read it? You are claiming that you are deplatforming this woman over this book, and you haven't read it. I don't know why people like that are allowed to run book festivals. Whatever you think of the New York Times, I couldn't have gotten away with that. I would have had, so I did read the book. It's not anti-Semitic. If you want to make a case that it's anti-Semitic, you at least have to quote accurately from it, which he wasn't doing. And I think what bothered me is that everybody picked up on this. He clearly had a bias. He clearly had an agenda, and everybody picked up on that uncritically and then used it to hammer Alice. And he just actually, I pulled up a post. He has a blog on the Atlantic, and he said in here, this was on April 1st, he said that he didn't think Alice should be deplatformed. He thinks that every time she appears at a public event or is interviewed by a publication, she should be asked at the outset to account for her anti-Semitic utterances, i.e. every time she appears in public, we should carry out an inquisition against an anti-Semitism that isn't there. So, I mean, I think he's quite proud of what he's done. I just want to say, as a writer and as, a professor and somebody who cares about culture, it's not just the personal assault against Alice, which angers me, but it is an attempt to essentially once again allow these trolls, as Ibsen said, life is to war with trolls, but to allow these people to make steps that impoverish our culture. Because by essentially removing Alice's voice, by discrediting her long body of work, what we're doing is eviscerating our own culture. So I'm proud to be here. Alice Walker's one of, a literary, intellectual, and moral icon, and I'm very happy you're doing this and that you invited me. Thank you. All right, I'll go. Since also 6 years of my shows just disappeared off of YouTube, not one of which was on Russia. Well, what's happened is we've undergone a corporate coup d'etat. You have watched the oligarchic elites now fuse into one party. The Romneys, the Bushes, they've all joined with the Democrats. And they're terrified of the rise of neo-fascism, Christian fascism. I wrote a book called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War on America. I was trying to reach out to them. I didn't use the word fascist lightly. I come out of seminary. I have seen how they acculturated the worst aspects of imperialism and white supremacy and capitalism and sacralized it with the Bible. It's complete. They're heretics. And you don't need to spend 3 years at Harvard Divinity School, as I did, to figure that out. Jesus didn't come to make us rich. So these are frightening forces. But the response is essentially stagnation. And it reminds me of 1932 in Weimar, Germany, when you saw von Papen. Everybody's scared of the Nazis. They should be scared of the Nazis. And all they want to do, like Biden and everyone else and Pelosi, is recreate the ancien regime, which nobody wants, which created the kind of economic and social and political distortions that gave rise to fascism. And they're barreling towards, by their own admission, horrendous defeat in the midterms. And they are facing the specter of, in the next presidential elections, a Trump or a Trump, and no, it's a cult. The Republican Party now is a cult. So it's either going to be Trump or someone anointed by Trump, Pompeo, I don't know, Cotton, somebody. And their response is censorship. So who do they censor? They censor critics, both on the left and the right. I happen to be on the left. And they first started hitting us with algorithms. That's what Prop or Not, Propaganda or Not, was about. 200 sites, and was of which I wrote on those sites, Truthdig originally before it shut down. As the walls close in on a decayed, discredited, and corrupt elite, their response is not to deal with the systemic issues that have created these distortions, but to censor. And so Alice is very right. It is going to get much worse because that is their only response. And we just saw Consortium News. I mean, these are not outliers. Consortium News is run by Joe Lauria, like me, an old newspaper guy. He was at the Wall Street Journal. I was the New York Times, Mint Press, antiwar.com. That's right. These guys are playing for keeps. And they magically think that the problem will go away if they shut down the voices of their critics. What they're actually doing, and I was opposed, by the way, of removing Trump from Twitter for this reason, because you don't want these opaque entities who know everything about us, we know nothing about them, to start carrying out this kind of wholesale censorship. I also knew that they would hardly stop with Alex Jones or Trump, and I didn't know I would be a victim so soon. The situation that we're going to face in the next literally weeks and months is very draconian and very frightening. And by removing Trump and these figures, and again, we can go back to Weimar, because remember, the Nazis were banned as a party, and there was all sorts of Goebbels and every Stryker were all hauled off to jail for hate speech, etc. All it did was turn them into martyrs, because there's so much anger at the dysfunction of the system itself. Yeah, Susan's right. They've lost the argument, the moral argument. I visit college campuses and speak. And when I spoke, I was there the week after at Northeastern, when they banned students for justice in Palestine. They banned them the same way. And every time I meet with those groups, a third or more of them are Jewish. So they've lost the argument. And that's why BDS may not have been successful, which all of us support, of course, in the same way we supported sanctions against the apartheid regime in South Africa. It may not have gotten universities to divest, but it essentially educated entire generations now within these college campuses, which is why they're frightened. And I just point out that the Israeli government is quite aware of that collapse of support, especially among a new generation of Jews in the United States, which is why it makes an alliance with the real anti-Semites, the Christian fascists. I mean, this is kind of the great irony. Not though when you look at Israeli history with South Africa. I mean, Israel was arming Rhodesia. But that shows, I think, the moral kind of bankruptcy, number one, of the Israel lobby and their supporters, but I think it also illustrates the fact that they don't have an argument to make. They've been found out. I just want to close by saying, I covered conflicts for 20 years in Latin America, 7 years in the Middle East. I covered the war in the former Yugoslavia, 6 years in Latin America and Africa. And what I noticed in disintegrating societies is that they always destroy their own culture first. Those cultural icons, those people who have the courage to speak truth, who don't engage in the kind of nationalist cant. Those were the first targets. I saw that in Yugoslavia. So it would be Croatian dissidents or Serbian dissidents like the Belgrade Circle, or those were the ones they went after. And I think that's what we're watching here. It's not limited to taking down Alice because of her support for Palestinians. It's part of a broader destruction of culture and the rise of a new kind of despotism, which Sheldon Wolin called inverted totalitarianism. You can read his book on it. But he was Cornel West's mentor at Princeton, by the way, Democracy Incorporated. But I think that is part of this process, that titanic intellectual, artistic, and moral figures threaten, beyond the debate about Palestine, threaten the despotism that we're barreling towards. And I think that going after Alice is part of that process.